Hello and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Democracy 2020 webinar entitled Destroying or Deploying the Deep State, Challenges to Federal Agencies. The Democracy 2020 webinar series is the project of the American Democracy Collaborative, which brings together scholars of American and comparative politics to think about the state of democracy in the United States through a deep engagement with American history, as well as with the insights that we can draw from around the globe. Our team is comprised of Robert Lieberman, Suzanne Mettler, Jamila Michener, Ken Roberts, Rick Vallely, and me. You can learn more about the American Democracy Collaborative by visiting our website, which is just americandemocracycollaborative.org. And I invite you to check back frequently for updates to our programming and our publications. Now, of course, today's webinar wouldn't be possible without a lot of behind-the-scenes help and support. And so on behalf of the American Democracy Collaborative, I'd like to especially acknowledge the support that we've received from Cornell University, with particular thanks to the Mario Einaudi Center for International Studies and to the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs for their generous sponsorship and other support. Now coming up, we've got two more webinars already scheduled. They're going to close out the Democracy 2020 series. The first of these on October 30th at this time, 2 p.m. Eastern, we'll have a webinar on the role of political parties and social movements in American politics. And on December 4th, also at 2 p.m., we'll be hosting a post-election discussion about the future of American democracy. Mark your calendars, these are going to be some pretty exciting events, and we look forward to seeing you at both of them. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Suzanne Mettler. Suzanne is the John L. Senior Professor of American Institutions in the Government Department at Cornell, and she's the author, together with Robert Lieberman, of an outstanding new book entitled Four Threats: The Recurring Crises of American Democracy. This book actually emerged from the work of the American Democracy Collaborative, and I think it represents one of the most exciting and thoughtful analyses of our current moment out there. It's also, I'll note, an excellent and accessible read. I highly recommend it for your holiday gift giving and also for your local socially distanced and socially responsible Zoom book club. I'll turn it over now to Suzanne, who will introduce our speakers for today.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. That was lovely to hear. I truly appreciate it. And welcome to all of you here today, whether you're joining us for the first time or whether you've come many times to our Democracy 2020 series. Today, we'll be talking about the American administrative state, the complex of agencies and departments that make up the federal government. Those who work in these offices are charged with carrying out the laws, regardless of which party controls the White House. Although polls routinely show that Americans today voice little trust in the federal government generally, nonetheless, large majorities of Americans across party have continued to rank specific agencies highly and to affirm government's role in the tasks they perform. President Donald Trump came into office vowing to deconstruct the administrative state, to disrupt what he termed the deep state, and to drain the swamp of the federal bureaucracy. What has actually transpired, and how could we think about it in historical or comparative perspective? And what is the impact on American democracy? We have a dream panel with us here to discuss these topics. Daniel Carpenter is the Allie S. Freed Professor of Government at Harvard University, and he is prolific in writing about the administrative state. For example, his books include Reputation and Power, Organizational Image and Pharmaceutical Regulation at the FDA, as well as The Forging of Bureaucratic Autonomy, Reputations, Networks, and Policy Innovation in Executive Agencies, 1862 to 1928. Jamila Michener is Associate Professor of Government at Cornell. She studies the politics of poverty, race, and public policy in the United States, and she's the author of Fragmented Democracy, Medicaid, Federalism, and Unequal Politics, as well as numerous scholarly articles and essays in popular outlets. Donald Moynihan is the inaugural McCourt Chair at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. His research examines how to improve how government works. He is the author of Administrative Burden, Policymaking by Other Means, with Pamela Hurd, and Behavioral Public Performance, how people make sense of government metrics. So welcome to our panelists. My first question for you is a broad question. Contemporary presidents of both parties have typically entered office with ambitions to alter the federal workforce or specific agencies, perhaps by trimming some parts and bolstering others. How have President Trump's efforts compared or contrasted with those of earlier presidents? And what are you most struck or surprised by? Let's start out with Dan.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you, with Professor Michener, and with Professor Moynihan. I think, let me make 3 points here, 2 about these differences, and then 1 about what I think it means for us normatively. I think what we've seen first off is that President Trump's appointments and his management of the administrative state has been based much more on loyalty to the president's person than on ideology or even partisanship per se. It's nice when we have a civil service that is managed according to neutral administrative standards. The history of American administration is full of cases where partisanship clearly affected that. You can look no further than the example of the Post Office Department. Before it was a government service, the Postmaster General used to often be the fundraising chair of the party, of the presidency. But that said, I think it's a little bit different now. Number one, we now have, we're more than a century past civil service reforms, including the Pendleton Act, which have put a distance between those administrative agencies and the president's party. We still have ideology, political and philosophical commitments, but much more in this administration, it seems to be a commitment to Trump himself that is first a criterion for selecting those individuals at the high level, and second, a kind of standard of behavior that they're held to. So one example would be the current Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy. There was both an official vetting process and an unofficial vetting process for that job that included the Secretary of the Treasury, Stephen Mnuchin, who was reported to have engaged in a set of questions about whether potential postmaster generals would in fact do what Trump wanted them to do. And as we know, Postmaster General DeJoy is a major Trump campaign donor. The second, I think, would be what we saw when the trade advisor, Peter Navarro, criticized the staff of the Food and Drug Administration for not being on what he called Trump time. And the idea there was, his concern was, look, the president, not necessarily the party, not necessarily a philosophical principle, has this need to get this vaccine out, and you at the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, need to follow suit. So again, the first point would be loyalty to the presidential person rather than the presidential position or even party or ideology. The second difference, and it's a difference of more degree rather than absolutes, is the use of the umbrella structure of executive departments to control the agencies within them. So an example of this would be, for instance, again, the Department of Health and Human Services, what I might call HHS as an acronym. What we refer to as the Center for Disease Control, CDC, or the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, those are within the Department of Health and Human Services. And a lot of the control that's being exercised, again, in the service more of Trump the person than of Trump the president, is by those officials not at the FDA or not at the CDC, but of orders coming down from presidential appointees at the Executive Department of Health and Human Services. And we got a really good taste of that this past week when Michael Caputo, who was the spokesperson and actually I think a deputy secretary at HHS for those positions, engaged in something of a wild, violent rant on Facebook Live and called his own CDC personnel seditious. I'm paraphrasing here. You can go online and get the exact remarks. But if you see also the emergency use authorization of convalescent plasma that made the news a few weeks ago by the Food and Drug Administration, the real push from that came a little bit less from Trump himself, although undoubtedly he wanted it to happen. It came from not even from within the Food and Drug Administration. It came from political appointees at the Department for Health and Human Services. So that second point is, again, the use of the umbrella structure of these executive departments to really drive the agenda and constrain what these agencies can do. And then finally, I'll just say, the reason I think this is important is not because the independence of agency expertise is important just for good public policy, but because this is the way that rule of law works. None of these agencies would exist were it not for statutes that created them. None of their powers would exist were it not for statutes that authorize those powers, and they wouldn't have any money to spend or positions for which to hire were it not for statutes passed by Congress, signed by previous presidents, that funded those agencies and appropriations. And to me, this is a fundamental issue about our democratic republic and about our Constitution. It's not just about good government, it's about the very foundations of our self-governing republic.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Now let's go to Professor Jamila Michener.
Hi, everyone. You know, it's difficult thinking about whether and how anything compares to the current moment. Often it's like everything feels so different. You know, I think about a core difference in my view between now and maybe the last time that there was quite this much fervor over or anxieties over something like the deep state, which was in the wake of Watergate, right? And at that time, there were actually a set of events that happened that made it reasonable for these anxieties to exist, that made it reasonable for a wide range of people to worry about what was happening in the administrative state and what its implications were for our democracy. I think a major difference now is that primarily, I mean, the anxieties like the ones that we're seeing right now over the deep state are always political, but sometimes there's also a basis to those anxieties. And I think right now the kind of political component of the fervor over the deep state is the primary component, right? It's in ways that are almost you know, hilarious, if not for, you know, the potential withering of our democracy. The deep state is used as a foil again and again. So I think about an example from New York, you know, where Cornell is and where I am. Republican Representative Claudia Tenney, in an attempt to defend Ben Carson and the Department of Health and of Housing and Urban Development, who was under some criticism because Ben Carson had spent a ton of money on expensive furniture. Carson himself blamed his wife. He said, no, it's her fault, right? But Claudia Tenney didn't blame Carson's wife or Carson. She said, this is all a conspiracy of the deep state. You know, it's not the furniture, the expensive furniture in Ben Carson's office, don't look there. Instead, look over here at the deep state. And this is consistently how this sort of trope of the deep state is being deployed now as really a distraction from all sorts of other things that are going on to erode democracy, some of which involve a direct attack of the administrative state. And so in order to distract us from that attack, we start talking about the deep state. It really is a foil. I'll just say one more quick thing about what really strikes me around the rhetoric and the discourse of the deep state right now and the assumptions we make about the way it operates, which is that as we understand the deep state as it's been sort of, as the language and discourse of the deep state has been deployed in the last several years under the Trump administration, the primary kind of victim of the deep state is President Trump himself. And by correspondingly, ostensibly democracy is the victim because our duly elected presidents will is undermined by rogue bureaucrats. But historically, when I think about at least recent historical examples, it's often the case that when there's something like the deep state that is operating, the victims aren't powerful people like President Trump. The victims are actually people who are at the margins. When we think about something like COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program that operated between the 1950s and the 1970s, and they were targeting folks at the margins. They were targeting organizations and leaders of movements around, civil rights, folks like the Black Panthers, feminist organizations, women's organizations, organizations they understood to have communist leanings. And that was actually the deep state. It was covert, it was illegal, and it was deployed to harm people at the margins. So this idea that like the primary problem with the deep state is that it's hurting our extremely powerful president, I think is very much out of sync with what, to the extent that anything like the deep state is operating with, what that kind of apparatus does.
Okay, thank you, Jamila. Now let's hear from Professor Donald Moynihan.
Thanks, Suzanne, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think I share many of the concerns that Dan and Jamila outlined. And one point I want to pick up on is the sort of sense of perpetual confusion or being overwhelmed that I think a lot of us feel much of the time. It's very hard for us to sometimes understand if a president's tweet is a meaningful indicator of change with the state. It's unprecedented, the language is shocking, but does it mean something really different in terms of the actual ways in which governance works in practice? And so I think it's helpful to think about this from a broader historical perspective. And I think when we do so, some patterns become more apparent. The first of these is there is a normalization of norm breaking that you have to go really far back into US history to find equivalent comparisons to, and it's occurring via political leadership, not just the president, but also the people that he's hired. So Dan mentioned Mark Caputo. It seems like every other day we have a whistleblower accusing the president or a senior leader of something that would have been a weeks-long scandal and career-ending for any other administration, but now gets swept away after 24 hours. So there's that normalization of norm breaking. The second point is that if you look at the sweep of US history and the relationship Americans have with government, there's always been this element of discomfort, but over time, this historical sweep has sort of moved towards an acceptance that neutral competence and expertise really had some value in improving the quality of government. So if you go back to Alexander Hamilton being accused as raising an army of federal bureaucrats by his critics, or Jackson heralding the spoils systems as a way to prevent a permanent class of bureaucrats, you see evidence of that discomfort. But then by the end of the 19th century, this idea that having these amateurs who are very partisan come in every 4 or 8 years and turnover was probably not a good thing for the quality of government, had started to take hold. And that argument had won the day for much of the 20th century. And at some point, we had a basic bipartisan agreement that protecting bureaucrats was probably pretty much a good thing for the quality of government. And that starts to erode again. And so this is, I think, my third point. You're seeing something different that didn't start with Trump, but started in the 60s and the 70s, where there's a partisan shift in the attitudes towards bureaucracy, where at a time when what Hofstadter described as the paranoid style of thinking starts to take hold in American politics, where there are these McCarthyite attacks on career civil servants as communists, that thread starts to become more and more of a feature of, in particular, Republican politics and rhetorics about the bureaucracy. And in the ensuing decades, you see both parties, but especially Republican presidents, using the power of the White House to gain more political control over the administrative state. And I think Trump has taken, in some cases, some of those tools that other presidents have used, and he's just sort of pushed them to the breaking point, sometimes beyond the breaking point in terms of legality. So if you look at things like centralizing the way in which resources are allocated, that's been sort of a classic ways in which White Houses have gained power over time, and Trump has sort of followed that pattern, but he's also done it to the point where he's broken the law, as we saw with the impeachment issue, which was primarily about can presidents withhold funds that Congress has already appropriated. And so there's a pattern partly of continuity, but then partly of really pushing those boundaries to a new place, I think, under Trump.
Okay, thank you, Don. Now, I do have one reminder for everyone who's listening in. We would love to have your questions, and feel free to type them right into the chat. And we will continue this conversation among the panelists for a while, but then we'll open things up and take as many of those questions as we can. Now, I want to, the panelists have already put a lot on the table. Before we dig into it further, I want to quickly discuss one matter of terminology. I'd like to know your reaction to the term deep state. This is a phrase that was rarely heard before the Trump era. And as Jamila notes, it's used in a political way. Does it connote skepticism about the very idea of a neutral, apolitical civil service, or even a kind of conspiratorial fear of the administrative state? And should we even be using this term? Would any of you like to jump in on this?
I can jump in. I mean, so on the surface, I guess, kind of most straightforwardly, I think of the deep state as an idea that implies that there's some entrenched bureaucratic officialdom, some shadow government that's operating in contradistinction to the will of the executive, right? To the will of, on the national level, at least the president. So that's the idea of the deep state. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it's an idea, a concept, not a reality per se. It's not to say that some of the anxieties around what reflected in the idea of the deep state may not be real in terms of, you know, what's happening in various bureaucratic agencies. But at the kind of most basic level, the deep state is an idea, and like all ideas, it's used for different purposes. And President Trump is using it for a particular set of purposes that range from distraction to deflection to justification for shrinking the federal bureaucracy and so on and so forth. And then I guess I would just say one more thing, which is when I first heard the term deep state, just from a kind of like my own personal experiential perspective, it didn't make any sense to me that suddenly we were calling the state deep and acting like that was a new thing. I thought like, yeah, the state is deep. The American state is very deep, the administrative state, and anyone who actually has to interact with that state, anyone who actually has to experience it and navigate it in their daily lives, especially people, for example, whose lives and well-being are dependent on the state in various ways, knows that the state is deep. Its tentacles go deep, run far and deep into all manner of people's lives, right? And sometimes that's in ways that are beneficial. Often that's in ways that are harmful. And often there are decisions made at the hands of administrators across levels, high-level administrators like the folks we've been talking about who lead these agencies, and street-level bureaucrats, right? But the people who are confronting the state in their daily lives most often know that the state is deep. So there's nothing new about the state being deep, but now we're thinking about this in a different sense, not in terms of what it means for everyday people, but in terms of how rogue bureaucrats inconvenience a president who wants to wrest as much power for himself as possible. And to me, that view of the deep state is much less compelling as far as my attention than the extent to which I want to think about what the state means for people who don't have power.
Dan, would you like to weigh in on this?
Yeah. first to just echo what Jamila said, that, you know, if we mean deep in the literal sense of kind of a deep penetration into people's lives, that's always been a feature of American government, especially of state and local governments in the 19th century, and that's true today. Most of the public health powers being carried out under emergency powers in the United States right now are really state governments, right? And that's important to keep in mind. I'm not fond of the term deep state, and that's no criticism to those who organized this fantastic event. I think it delegitimizes public service, and the reason that I worry about it is in part, if you look at the origins of the term, it's taken from authoritarian rule in Turkey and the kinds of investigations that happened under Erdogan there. And it seems to suggest that there are kind of, you know, plotting subterranean, this is the other sense of the term deep, you know, conspiratorially deep bureaucrats and administrators who are conspiring against the popular will. And I guess I would go back to, you know, the point I made earlier is that, you know, the idea that administrators and bureaucrats would act in a way that's inconsistent with a current president or even a current presidential majority is not something that in a constitutional republic we should be necessarily worried about. Their allegiance has to be to the statutes, to the laws. A really important way that the rule of law works is whereby administrators have as their first allegiance the law and not the currently governing politicians. If they are being unfaithful to the law, then that's a real problem. But we also have a lot of mechanisms, including judicial review, inspectors general, and other ways for our, you know, for our elected officials to get at that.
So to pick up on Dan's point really quickly, I think if you substitute rule of law for the term deep state or expertise for the term deep state in many of Trump's tweets or messages, the sentences would make much more logical sense. And in many ways, that this is, you know, first of all, it's a language of delegitimization. You know, we've gone from previous presidential rhetoric where Reagan said the government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem, or George H.W. Bush talking about good people trapped in bad systems, where there was at least the benefit of the doubt given to the individual bureaucrat, even by presidents who are suspicious of the state, to now this much more conspiratorial mindset where Trump seems to truly believe that the state is pursuing him personally and trying to bring him down. And so, you know, he's talked about, for example, the deep state as the reason why his political rivals are protected from prosecution and why he's been victimized by unjustified smears by a government that's similar to Nazi Germany. That the language is incredibly extreme. And so I think it has, in addition to attacking the individual public sector bureaucrats, also this broader effect on the public where it becomes this trigger for both polarized thinking, but also conspiratorial thinking. And so this, I'm putting my behavioral scientist hat on now, where we use language to trigger people to start thinking in this sort of system one approach to the world, where they go directly from seeing a phrase to fitting that with their political beliefs. And I think deep state is one of those triggers that lets people not really think about what's the evidence here, what's going on, but simply to define people as friends or foes and make these really snap judgments where they decide, I'm with the president, therefore whatever these administrators are doing is wrong. The third point, which I think again echoes what Jamila says, is even at the political appointee level, you see this term being used to justify actions that in normal times they simply couldn't justify. So you've seen White House officials use the term deep state to justify not giving attention to the recommendations of CDC scientists, right, for example. So they can dismiss their expertise simply by invoking the term. And in that respect, it has some of the power of the term fake news that people also like to use quite frequently in the Trump administration.
Great, thank you. By the way, I misspoke earlier. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat. We don't have the chat enabled. Okay, well now I would like to turn to the question of downsizing. Many presidents have come into office over the past many decades saying that they want to scale back some part of government or agencies. How has the administrative state held up in these past 4 years in that respect? And if you believe that harm has been done, how would you characterize it? Is it in terms of size, resources, professionalism, reputation, morale, or something else? And it would be interesting to hear if you think that there are some agencies that have suffered the most harm, others that have perhaps been strengthened and or have remained unscathed. Who shall we hear from first this time? Dan, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I wouldn't say downsizing is necessarily the descriptive term I would use. I would say erosion of the state, in part with capacities, but I would really say with respect to norms and reputation. So Don Moynihan earlier mentioned this kind of normalization of norm breaking. And norms are built up slowly, but can be broken and erode very quickly. I think that's something that we learn very commonly in the behavioral and observational social sciences. And there have been a number of such norms that have been broken. Go back to, again, Michael Caputo and the way he both, talked about his fellow civil servants this past week, the language he's used towards journalists, some of which has come out in public, some of which I can say has not. And some of the really belligerent kind of anti-journalistic behavior that one has seen. I also, some of the things that have begun to happen at the Department of Justice, where there are kind of dismissals of career prosecutors or heads of DOJ offices, in part because not because of performance issues, but because it might be the case that some of these career prosecutors are getting perhaps too close to something that might involve the president. In terms of reputation, I think you can see this very clearly. The reputation of the Centers for Disease Control and the reputation of the Food and Drug Administration have suffered badly. Probably the best example of the latter is that, when the FDA approves a drug, we're not supposed to have to doubt its efficacy. We think it's going to work. And yet, we started already with a world in which there are a lot of vaccine doubters. Now we can add to that population a whole set of people who are going to doubt what the FDA approves because they think they've done it under the thumb of Trump. And that is a really dangerous world to be in. I've argued elsewhere that it not only affects the degree of uptake of the vaccine, which is going to affect all of our public health, it's going to affect the next round of investments, if you will, the kind of financial ecology of investments in biotech R&D, which is also going to be a deep problem. So I would, again, just emphasize that I think in terms of the erosion of the state right now, it's kind of those norms and reputations that have been most eroded. That's not to say there aren't resource issues, but I'll leave it to my fellow panelists to reflect on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and speak to directly that, the kind of the resource end of this, especially from just within my wheelhouse from a health policy context. And not only is it in my wheelhouse, but it's now in all of our wheelhouses because we're now all living through a global health pandemic that in particular on the domestic level, we've handled quite terribly And it's worth pointing out the connection between that, something that we're all experiencing in our daily lives right now, and choices made around the administrative state. And certainly the erosion of the administrative state in some of the ways that Dan points out with respect to reputation and norms, but also in a really concrete and material way with respect to things that matter for public health. So some of the agencies that have fared worse under the Trump administration have been agencies that are connected to health, right? So if we think about the Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, HRSA has lost hundreds of millions of dollars in funding, and you know, HRSA does super controversial things like think about child and maternal health and try to lower rates of maternal mortality and infant mortality. You know, this is the kind of organization that's losing funding under the kind of banner of downsizing the government. Our Public Health Service Corps has decreased by about 40% since the Trump administration, and very self-consciously. It's not as though these things are just happening or they're just a function of budgets. These are things that Trump set out to do at the sort of initiation of his presidency and has consistently been doing, right? Trump also proposed cutting 40% of all public health professionals. So the doctors, the nurses, the folks who are part of the kind of the federal arm of public health, those folks have been losing their jobs. They were losing their jobs before the coronavirus, and made us sort of less equipped and less well prepared to deal with and address the pandemic as it began to attack our country. And so, and the last thing I'd point out along these lines is that, you know, who loses when these kinds of these forms of material retrenchment occur? You know, you can think of something like federal downsizing, and it doesn't sound that bad, and it's like, oh well, maybe this is efficiency, and we're cutting the red tape, and we have all of these euphemisms and all of these tropes that we trot out to make it seem like all of these things are a good idea. But when it comes to agencies like the Health Research and Services Administration and the CDC and the Public Health Corps, like these are people's lives we're talking about, people who are not going to be protected in the same way that they would have because these agencies are weakened and don't have sufficient resources.
Okay, Don, before you jump in, let me jump in because in the interest of time, I want to broaden the question a bit. We build this panelist thinking about whether the administrative state is being destroyed or deployed, or to what extent maybe some of each of those things might be happening. And so I'd like you to think as well as about these issues of erosion. To what extent might the Trump administration be weaponizing the administrative state or parts of it, deploying its power for the president's own political purposes, or derailing and redirecting the mission of agencies? Do you see much evidence of this? And if so, does it strike you as something new and different from what other presidents have done or not?
So I do see evidence of that, and so that there are a couple of things happening at the same time. But one thing to understand about Trump is that he's been a very unsuccessful president when it comes to legislative achievements. He had 2 years with a Republican Congress, and basically they got tax cuts done and very little else in terms of legislative achievement. So he's a president whose achievements are really limited by his capacity to manage bureaucracy. One of the reasons we haven't seen a large-scale downsizing of the federal bureaucracy is that he would not be able to get civil service reform passed. He has done some stuff with executive orders to make it easier to hire people. He has done things like move part of the research arm of the USDA to Kansas City to try and get the bureaucrats working in that unit to leave, and most of them did. But he's been very much limited to his executive power. And there are places where that has not really made much of a difference, and there are places where I think he's been quite successful. And so Jamila and I are both familiar with parts of HHS, the Health and Human Services, that creates rules for states about how Medicaid and Medicare provide services. I think they have set up a framework to really encourage states to make it harder for people, in effect, to get access to healthcare. I think the most striking example for me is the area of immigration. So the Department of Homeland Security is one of those examples that has been an absolute priority for Trump. He's giving them resources, he's brought them to the center of his administration, and arguably has been quite successful. If your goal is to limit immigration, both legal, illegal, refugees who are applying, they have found every possible means to change the administrative machinery to simply make it harder for people to enter the country. And I think that reflects partly that this is a policy area where Trump has gotten a lot of discretion from Congress, and maybe all presidents have too much discretion from Congress in this area, but also he has a very skillful policy entrepreneur in Stephen Miller who knows the policy levers quite well and can find aspects of the administrative machinery to make those policy outputs happen.
Dan, could you weigh in on this briefly? To what extent should our concern be that the Trump administration has weaponized the administrative state?
I, generally agree. I think Don Moynihan's diagnosis is exactly correct. What the Trump administration has not been able to do by vehicles of legislation and statute, it has tried to do, and in many cases succeeded, via administrative fiat. In part, that's where the norm breaking comes from, because if there are policy goals that you have and you can't attain them through statute, then you try to push levers of administration. And there may be either laws or norms, basically as we as political scientists study them as institutions that constrain that. And that's exactly the friction, if not the real abrasion that you're starting to see. I guess, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but if I had to think going forward of, one of the things that we're going to be in need of in not just the years to come and not just about as a response to the Trump administration, but more generally, is I think there's a growing bipartisan sense that we need a strengthening of congressional capacity and especially of congressional oversight. Now, there are times when congressional oversight can very much get in the way of effective administration. Yes, that's absolutely correct. But the problem is now, is I think we're entering this period, and it began well before Trump, where we're entering a world in this country, at least at the national level, where there's increasingly a presidential monopoly on those tools of administration, and the ability of Congress to constrain those is ever more limited. And part of, I think, what we're also going to need is a strengthening of the inspectors general in their role. And that is in part what Congress has in terms of its oversight. But there are some aspects of what inspectors general can do to refer matters either to the Department of Justice or to Congress that I think maybe we want to routinize and even protect further in the years to come.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to ask each of the panelists for an answer to one more rather large question, and then we will go to the questions from our audience. What is the impact of the changes you observe, and what is to be done? And you get 2 minutes. What is the impact in terms of making the United States vulnerable in various ways, and for democracy? Is there harm to the idea of having a professional civil service that's above partisan politics, that can defend the broader public interest? And to the extent damage has occurred, how can it be repaired? Let's hear first from Jamila.
Sure, the big question, and first from me. Thanks, Suzanne. No, I'm only joking. I think we've picked up on some of this throughout our discussion so far. And so I would sort of reiterate some of that and say I think that the impact has been multifaceted, and it's been generally negative, right? So that's both in terms of the kind of like the reputation of the administrative state and of these different agencies, and on 2 levels. One is with respect to like just trust in the public more generally, right? I think that in fact, and I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of people from many different communities are consistently interacting with various facets of the administrative state. And so it's a part of the kind of experience of citizenship in a democracy. And I think to the extent that people are sort of bringing negative impressions and expectations to those experiences and interactions, that's not good. And in general, I think it erodes already wavering and quite low confidence in democracy, and that can have a range of ripple effects. And then I think that it has implications also for the relationships between the different branches of government in the US context. And some of what Dan said pointed to this, but there's a set of relationships and a often tenuous and very difficult to find equilibrium between the precise role that the administrative state is playing, the role that Congress is playing, the role that the president is playing. And every presidential administration, you know, this changes. It's a dynamic set of relationships, but there is a kind of, there's some sort of equilibrium that is positive for democracy as the goal. And I think that what's happened over the last several years has completely thrown that off in a way that I think undermines the ability of these different branches of government to work together in towards ends that are ostensibly going to be beneficial for the American people. So I think that's a major problem. I have lots more thoughts, but I'm going to stop because I want to give us enough time for Q&A and hear what Dan and Don have to say.
Don, would you like to jump in on this?
Yeah, so Dan mentioned something like this earlier, which is we study government, and a lot of the time it's very hard to quickly connect deinstitutionalization and declines in capacity with observable outcomes. And so much of the time we sort of sound like the boy who cried wolf. But we are seeing with the COVID-19 response a real-time demonstration of the quality of government mattering in people's lives in very demonstrable ways, and the way in which poor political leadership has hurt our ability to corral this extraordinary pandemic. We just saw a story yesterday about the White House blocking a plan that the USPS had in April to send out face masks to every household in America. So there's some really tangible examples there of governmental failures making a difference to the United States, as well as to our reputation abroad, I think, as a country that has its act together. One tangible change I would like to see is simply fewer political appointees. This has been a standard good government proposal since at least the first Volcker Commission back in the late 1980s. And every so often we bring it to the table and nothing happens. We have something like 4,000 appointees, and a lot of them were simply not people who should have been in any public sector job, but got positions of high responsibility in the Trump administration. So passing legislation that would cap that number to something like 1,500 or 2,000 would be a big investment in improving the quality of government. I hope that if there's a change in administration, the Biden administration, if it comes to pass, will be looking closely at day one fixes that they can implement. And so I gave the example of immigration earlier, where they could look for specific changes that have been made via executive order or a level beneath executive order where formal guidance has been given to agencies like Customs and Border Patrols to wind that back. But I think for some of those agencies, you're going to have something, you're going to need something akin to a Truth and Reconciliation Committee or a Blue Ribbon Commission that can really go in to see what happened, because for some of those agencies, we don't know what's happening in terms of the use of state power, and we're unlikely to know unless we have some outside actors in addition to the inspectors general to help shine a light on what happened.
Dan, let's hear your thoughts on this.
I'm not sure I can improve much on what Jamila and Don just said. That was just really excellent. Let me just give you one example of, I think, where it's actually affecting us. I mean, COVID is perfect example, right? I think it was on September 11th, maybe another day, Canada had 0 deaths nationwide from COVID, whereas we're averaging about 1,000 a day. And yes, there are other differences than, differences other than public administration at work there. I recognize that. But it in part suggests something about the fact that an economy which is many size the times of Canada's, does not shield us as a nation from the brunt of this. Also, the post office I mentioned earlier, DeJoy's, Postmaster General DeJoy's management changes, which at some level, and I think there was a federal court decision basically confirming this yesterday, just made no sense from a management perspective, like even a supply chain perspective. The idea that a truck had to go out, even if all the mail was not ready to be put on it, just had to go out at 5 o'clock or had to go out at a certain time. Any kind of adaptive supply chain management model from the public or private sector would suggest that you just avoid that kind of rigidity. And now you have people getting their medications late. I know of some researchers who are starting to look into basically what's going to happen with medication adherence using these postal delays, which are now statistically documented. As an example, as and many people now rely upon the Postal Service for their medications. I've already mentioned a couple of points that I think can be done. I want to second Don's point about limiting political appointees. I think increasing congressional capacity and oversight. I think we're going to be at a place in the next few years, and I think it's going to come from, I don't want to say entirely across the spectrum, but from more than one party, or from some Republicans as well, where there's going to be a pressure for an increase of public employment. And I think it's important to remember that, these public servants are also people. Don mentioned rightly that there's been a turn since the 1960s. Just happens to coincide with people of color gaining more and more of an entry into the federal civil service. You see that especially at the local and state level now. You see it in the post office. What is it? African Americans represent about 12% of the private workforce, about 28% of the Postal Service. I think it's important to keep in mind that in many ways, the civil service and the military service have actually been on the leading edge of forces for equality and integration in the United States. There's some good to be done there. I'll conclude by saying, I just finished a lecture this week on the Roman Republic, thinking about the history of representative government. The Roman Republic had all sorts of public construction and works programs with which it employed many of its citizens. Much of its economy was based upon public employment. I don't think we should be afraid of thoughtful, constrained experiments in that direction in the years to come, not least for purposes of economic policy.
Okay, terrific. Now we have, I think we've had 32 questions put into the queues, and they're fantastic questions. So I'm actually going to give you a few of them to be ruminating about and at a time. And then, don't feel you need to answer all of them. You might, choose a particular one, each one of you, to be answering. Now, a couple of the questions are along the lines of what Dan and Don have just been discussing about where do we go from here. Didi Quo asks, will Trump and Trumpism provide an opportunity for bipartisan reform of the administrative state, like a new Pendleton Act, and what might that look like? And a related question comes from Stephen Pimpare. We know that we have seen a hollowing out of the federal bureaucracy, especially in the state and justice departments, in which career civil servants have left the agencies while vacant positions remain unfilled. Do you have any sense of the scale of this across the federal government? And what can you say about the challenges that a Biden-Harris administration would face in rebuilding competence? Let's make answers to these really brief because we have so many questions, and you don't all need to weigh in on each of these.
I'll really briefly respond to the first question. I don't think there's going to be a government-wide piece of legislation to improve government in the next Congress if Trump is defeated. I just don't think there's a political alignment of Republicans and Democrats who agree enough about the future of the public service to create that legislation. There may be policy areas such as within, say, the Postal Service, where there are new commitments to fixing specific problems. But the reality is Republicans or Democrats really disagree about the nature of the public service and the way it should be governed. And I don't think Trump has brought them closer together.
Yeah, I guess I would just chime in and say, especially to the kind of latter part of Stephen Pampari's question about what lays ahead as far as rebuilding the competence of the administrative state, and, you know, assuming, for example, that there's we're in another administration. I don't think that a new administration gets us out of some of these challenges. So first of all, really quickly, I think that some of these challenges are like pretty fundamental and core. Like, I don't think that there is an agreement, and Don got at some of this when he talked about how views of the kind of role of public administration has changed over time. But I don't think that there's any core consensus or agreement on what the role of the administrative state is, what precisely those agencies and the people who make them up should be doing, and how that relates to democracy. And so there's a constant kind of tension and set of anxieties there that have never really been resolved and perhaps can't be resolved. They're just a part of, you know, governance. But those things have been worsened. And I think that means from anyone who wants to sort of take up this mantle from this point going on is going to be even more difficult. And I think the salience of the idea of the deep state is going to make it more challenging. More people are paying attention. More people are suspicious and conspiratorial in their understanding of the administrative state. So any improvement, any building is going to be under the limelight. And I think that's going to make it much more challenging given how deeply polarized we are.
Okay, I'm going to give you a question now that comes from one of us in the American Democracy Collaborative, and that is Ken Roberts. In the study of comparative politics, especially in developing regions, scholars would borrow from Weber to say that Trump has a highly patrimonial conception of the state and political authority, meaning a conception of the state as serving the personal interests of the ruler, both political and economic. How does this square with the conventional notion of the administrative state as it has typically been understood in American politics? Dan, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent observation by Professor Roberts. The key is that he's trying to build this patrimonial enterprise on the scaffolding of another of Weber's concepts, which is the actual bureaucratic state, right? These are, in Weber, two different modes of what he called domination or Herrschaft. And how do you do that? Well, you don't have the existing patrimonial institutions with which to do it. And you don't even have, which is kind of a hybrid kind of, patronage institutions with which to do it. It's essentially a mix, kind of a kit bag of different arrangements. One is, of course, he's relied heavily on what Don Moynihan has rightly criticized, which is the ample opportunities for political appointees in these agencies. And we saw that with Caputo. Caputo is a political appointee, not clear, just given the individual's mental health issues, that he should be in government office. Many other capable civil servants, Republicans, have served in many administrations, so that's really not about partisanship there. The other would be, I think, personal networks. Patrimonial regimes rely heavily upon, a set of networks that connect the ruler and the ruler's family. I think it's worth keeping in mind in these older dynastic settings. The ruler's family with a set of actual and potential state officials. And you're starting to see that right now. So where did Caputo come from? Caputo came from his alliances with, as we know, Roger Stone. And Caputo worked in Russia as an image manager for Vladimir Putin. I don't know whether that amounts to a part of Trump's family network or not, but I think it says a lot about those kinds of settings. And I think the only other thing I would add there is I think it's kind of fascinating that some of the older networks, such as the Reagan and Bush party officials that Trump would have relied on, simply aren't there, and it goes into the rift. So I would focus, if we get a second Trump administration, or there's going to be another Trump in America's future as president or as presidential candidate, I think you're going to see deep ties among those family and enterprise networks, which include global ties. I'm not trying to make a conspiracy point here. That's just the world we live in. That might be marshaled for that kind of rule.
Okay, I'm going to turn now to a question from Doug Yoder. Running against the bureaucracy as being inefficient is not new, but this iteration is characterizing the behavior of the deep state as seditious and is abandoning facts and science as the basis for policy. For career civil servants, this is different. How should employees respond? I think this is a really interesting question, and it reminds me of Rosemary O'Leary's work when she wrote about what she called guerrilla bureaucrats in the Reagan administration and the EPA who resisted what they were being told by political appointees. I'm really interested in your thoughts about this. What should career civil servants do?
I think we're seeing some examples of career civil servants using, to go back to an earlier framework, the Hirschman exit, voice, and loyalty framework, using a combination of those strategies. So some have left. We know there was an increase in turnover immediately after Trump was elected. And if he was reelected, I would expect you'll see a similar bump. And some of them have exited and combined their exits with voice. So there's a whole string of op-eds in the Washington Post from disaffected bureaucrats who have complained. Some of these are now political appointees. So I think it's hard for me to recall an administration where as many whistleblowers emerged using that combination of exit and voice to draw attention to problems. The solution, however, depends upon Congress taking those complaints seriously and being willing to act upon them. And, as we saw with the impeachment proceedings, at least the Senate is not willing to fully pursue the end results of responding to whistleblower complaints. So I think you're certainly seeing a lot of effort by some career civil servants to say this is a moment of crisis and we're going to pull back the curtain and explain what's going on. But ultimately, they're dependent upon their elected officials just as the rest of us are.
Great, thank you. Now I'd like to raise a question from Austin Aldag, and I'd like to direct this one to Jamila. Do all of these phenomena take hold only at the national scale? What about state and local governments?
Yeah, I think that there's, this is cross levels, and I think that's an important question in part because, of course, what's happening at the state and local level is connected to what's happening at the federal level, and so federal, state, local, these levels are connected to each other, and so there's naturally we're going to see reverberations across them. I think that Don pointed to a useful example earlier when he talked about, some of what was happening around Medicaid, for example. And I think that what we see is a lot of variation in terms of how states and localities are reacting here. On the one hand, I think that, states can be a little bit of they can sort of buttress some of the more harmful consequences that we've been talking about throughout this conversation, right? By allowing kind of state level versions of these agencies to continue to implement things in a way that reflects, either reflects what's scientifically sound or reflects what's best for their populations or what have you. And so, you know, even if the federal government is saying that, is giving agencies leave to do things that otherwise are not potentially are especially beneficial, state governments can sort of say, well, no, we're not going to do that. So I think that the discretion that federalism gives to states and localities can be useful here in pushing back against some of the more negative things happening at the federal level, but the opposite is also true, right? The opposite is also true. So certainly states and localities are implicated, but I guess I would say that that doesn't have any clear valence, right? That can be good or it can be bad. That can sort of amplify and exacerbate some of the patterns we've been talking about at the national level, or it can sort of be a bit of an antidote to them. And that really depends on politics on those levels, right? And on the kind of intergovernmental politics that occurs across those levels. So that makes the picture a lot more complex in ways that I think that we need to attend to.
Okay, now I'm going to raise a question that comes to us from Niels Nielsen. In the private sector, we applaud and reward those who disrupt industries and markets, driving innovation in some very positive and constructive ways. Is disruption ever valuable for federal bureaucracies? If so, when and how? Who might like to take that question? Dan?
Yeah, I'll take it. I think the first thing I would put out as a cautionary note. Disruption is a very appealing and alluring metaphor, but I would strongly recommend Jill Lepore's essay on disruptive innovation in the New Yorker from some years back, as well as a study done by the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth that casts a fair amount of doubt on the effectiveness of disruptive innovation as a strategy. It's certainly the case when we find that systems are sclerotic, we might want to reform them, and disruption might be a good metaphor. But I don't think it's a consensus, and it's definitely not a consensus in the management literature that disruptive innovation is the way to go. That said, it's one of the things that I would say, among the things that arguably need to be disrupted, and when we're talking about the administrative state, I would say are severalfold. One, what Don Moynihan referred to earlier as norm breaking. There's a pattern that's become entrenched very recently of that, and I think it's problematic, and I think it needs to be looked at. There have been ongoing issues. This was actually a problem under the Obama administration with IT design and procurement that a lot of people have looked at, and I think there's definitely some room for examination and reflection there. And the final thing I'll say, and we really haven't talked about this because it's been largely about the administrative state at the federal level, but a big part of the Black Lives Matter movement is about disrupting the administrative model of American policing, right? And that's, okay, we've talked about state and local government. That's more in Professor Michener's wheelhouse, and I'm not an expert on that. But of course, the same kinds of questions that are being raised about American policing also are being raised about ICE and its detention practices, a number of other administrative practices of the federal government. And I actually think it's maybe helpful to examine. It's a much more multifaceted movement than I can possibly, explain or touch on here. But if we want to think about what healthy disruption might look like, maybe some of that's going on as we're looking at, the forces of local and state coercion in our society.
I just wanted to add to that question. It's a great question, partly because it gets at the heart of a sort of pro-private, anti-government ethos that shapes a lot of our discourse about public administration. And I'm all for disruption in the private sector because that'll generate some gains and efficiencies in companies that do it well, and the ones that do it badly will go out of business. The problem with the public sector is it doesn't go out of business. And so disruptions that become embedded and are harmful continue over time. And I think we are seeing an illustration of that point now, where people who are taking public money and are nominally accountable to the public and Congress are disrupting the public sector in a way that's creating a very large mess, and it's going to take us a long time to fix. And so I think the metaphor doesn't quite work, because we're not in a market system when we're talking about government. It's simply a different thing. There are other paths to innovation, and there's a whole literature on innovation in the public sector. So some of this occurs more slowly, more incrementally. But I think the idea of Trump as a disruptor who, disrupted the casino business and then went out of business, and was taking those skills to the public sector is sort of a misleading way for thinking about what he can offer to government.
Can I quickly just add on to that? I think just to connect Don's point to my earlier point about rule of law, there's an extent to which we don't want disruption for disruption's sake, or even necessarily disruption for efficiency's sake, to happen in the public sector unless it occurs by means, small r Republican institutions, by the rule of law. And so, if the argument is, oh, well, a democratic republic is inefficient and separated powers are inefficient, that's entirely something else. Then we need to disrupt our constitutional framework. But I would be very worried about just bringing in disruption to the private sector by means of a managerial agenda that wasn't accompanied by appropriate and well-deliberated statutory reforms.
Can I add something very quickly, which is to say, I agree with the sort of the caveats and the caution around disruption, and with the idea that notion doesn't translate as easily in the public sector as it does in the private. But I will say one underlying kind of thread of that question that I appreciate is that it's oriented towards how the administrative state can be deployed in ways that are sort of positive and democracy enhancing. And I think a lot of this conversation has been around how the administrative state is being weaponized, how it's being used as a foil, how it's being used in all of these negative ways. And part of that is because, we're very much thinking about this through the lens of the last several years and through the lens of Trump. But I think moving forward, a really productive way to try to engage and think about the possibilities of the administrative state is to think through the ways that it can be used to enhance democracy. Particularly, I think there's possibilities for this on the state and local level. And I think some of that is what Dan was gesturing towards when he talked about thinking about policing and Black Lives Matters and the ways that folks are trying to reorient the state with an eye towards what's good for people in communities. And especially, as I mentioned at the beginning, the people who are most vulnerable and who are most marginal, who actually have the most at stake when it comes to thinking about the deep state as we've been talking about it.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, I'm sad to see that we only have a few minutes left. As usual, we've had many, many more fantastic questions than we have time to ask. I'm going to raise one more question and give the panelists a chance to weigh in on it and to make any final comments they would like to make. This question comes from Isabel Pereira. I wonder if the panelists can help us unpack a paradox. Extremists, for example, QAnon, locate the deep state in powerful intelligence agencies, and they tend to view President Trump as an anti-establishment response to that kind of surveillance. At the same time, the Trump administration has deployed precisely this and similar tools for electoral, financial, and other ends, and yet is not accused of deep statism for doing this. How do you make sense of this?
Well, I think it's not as much of a mystery as we might believe. Trump is a hypocrite about many things, so he will use language and do exactly the opposite in his political or private life. And I think he's partly owned the term deep state in a US context, and in doing so has sort of protected himself against accusations here. I will say that I'm really concerned about what Donald Rumsfeld once described as unknown unknowns. And we're all sort of policy or government nerds here, and so we know aspects about how the state works. This idea of an almost parallel religion that's developing around beliefs about QAnon in which the deep state is enmeshed is really troubling to me, because I don't know what that means in practice for the future of how we govern. If this becomes, and we know there'll be some Congress people in the next Congress who hold some of those beliefs, but if this becomes a significant part of our political life, then it's really troubling, because some of those beliefs are incredibly extreme and would justify doing incredibly extreme things if you held those beliefs. And so it's this blind spot, I think, that we have that we're struggling to deal with right now.
Okay, Jamila?
Yeah, I actually think that Don said a lot just now, but I guess I don't read this as much as a paradox, in part for reasons that Don just laid out. It makes perfect sense given the kind of the development of this notion of the deep state over the last several years, that it wouldn't necessarily be turned on Trump and used against him. But I guess more broadly than that, I would say it underscores the extent to which the deep state is not a real thing that we can sort of objectively identify and say, oh, there's the deep state, and there's the deep state, and there's the deep state. And if we could do it, if it were a real thing that we were just objectively identifying, then we would be just as likely to see it as it was operating in the Trump administration as we would be to see it operating elsewhere. But that's not what it is. It's not a real thing. It's a trope. It's a tool. It has a political work that it is doing. And so it's going to be used in ways that reflect who wants to use it and for what political purposes, and that reflect things like our ideological intentions, that reflect sort of who it is that we want to other, who we want to accuse, and so on and so forth. So I don't expect that the deep state is something that is an accusation that will be rendered equitably, right? That's just not the nature of what that idea is doing.
All right, and I'm going to give Dan the last word.
Always a dangerous thing to do, Suzanne. Thank you. It was, again, an honor to appear on this panel. I would say just a couple things. I can't really improve on what Jamila and Don said. I think we just need to dump the term deep state. I don't think we'd be that worse off in just about any dimension if we did. I think it's largely misleading. I also think, just to extend on what Jamila said, and what Don said about the dangers of this kind of language, conspiratorial language often engages in what you might call organizational attribution. It imagines a set of forces that are nefarious and imagines them far more coordinated than they actually are. And so what did actually Trump appointee Christopher Wray say yesterday? He's the head of the FBI, about this organization that we call Antifa. He says, well, there are maybe people who identify under that label, but they're not organized. It's not a well-examined network. Are there potentially actors in the federal government who have tried to resist the Trump administration's initiatives? Are there others who tried to resist the Obama administration's initiatives? You know, individually, yes, but I actually do think we have a set of institutions for dealing with that. The notion of a deep state, conjures a world where these people have a set of tools that are invisible both to us and largely to Trump, and are using them in some kind of concert that is undetectable to anybody but the people making this accusation. And I think it's worth pointing out that that's the way a lot of conspiracies work. We imagine a group of enemies, and we imagine they're far more coordinated than they could possibly be. And I think that's one of the many, many problems with the term. And I hope that one result of this awesome panel is that we ditch that phrase.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you so much to all three of you, to Professors Carpenter, Michener, and Moynihan. You've all given us so much to think about. And thank you all for attending today, this Democracy 2020 event. We hope to see you again next time, which is October 30th. We'll be talking about political parties and social movements then, and then again on December 4th, when we'll have a post-election discussion of the future of American democracy. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone.